Welcome back. So this is part 3 of the Test Driven Laravel course that we've been working on. Remember, if you missed any of the first couple of episodes, go ahead and catch those first, as all of these episodes have been building up to each other. So if you missed the first couple, you're not going to quite understand what we're going to be working on in this one. Before I continue, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and hit the bell button. That way you're the first to know about any new episodes for this course or any of the other courses that we have here at Coders Tape. So let's dive right to it. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and run my tests, and everything is green. An important concept about test-driven development is that you always want to go from green state to green state. You never want to start a refactor in a red state. So we are at a green state, so we can go on to the next section. Of course, anytime we make a change to a test, that will make it fail. Then we change our code, and we come back and rerun our tests. And if we did everything right, obviously we're back to green. And then we do that over and over and over and over. So with all of that, yes, we are at green. Let's go ahead and go on to the next section that I want to work on. So we worked on the authors section here in the previous episode. However, if we go back to the book reservation, right now an author is just a string, right? And that's not quite the functionality that we want. What we would really want is if they give us a string, then maybe what I need to do is check in the database if that author exists, and then I can either create one or I can go ahead and assign the correct author ID for that author. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this, right? Because we could theoretically have a list of authors. Think of the UI for a second. We could theoretically have a drop-down menu with all of the available authors that we have and put those in the database. But as you can imagine, this list would be quite large. And so that's probably not what we really want. I think the expected behavior would be something where we have some predictive text, and perhaps when they start typing into the box, maybe we can guess what the author is going to be based off of things that we have in our database. And if not, we can go ahead and default to just a regular author. So that's quite good. I do like that idea. I'm going to keep going with it. What we have here is simply a way for us to add an author manually. And now we can actually get rid of without exception handling, and I believe our test will still be green. And yes, they are. Great. So how do we start to even tackle this? How about we start it with a fresh test, and then we'll have to go back and probably modify some of these tests and some of the assertions that we are doing. So let's just say a new author is automatically added. All right, so a quick point here. This new author is technically inside the book management test. So should that be in the book management test or should that be in the author test? Well, I can make arguments for either one, but here's the way that I see it. It's going to live in the book because the endpoint that we're going to hit is the endpoint for books. If we were going to hit the endpoint for author, then I think it would make more sense that that test would actually live in our author management test. But because we are going to hit this post inside the books resource, and the books resource is the one that's supposed to trigger this add or give me an ID type of functionality, then I think it's better suited for the book test. So what could we possibly do here? Well, we do have this. Let's go ahead and do that. And what we really want to assert is the following. Let's assert count of 1, but not in my books, but rather in my author. So in app author, if we grab all of them, then I really expect to have a count of 1. And the way that that would kind of work is right now we do have this date of birth, which is required. So we are going to have to do a little bit of finagling to make this work. But here's the deal. If we were to go ahead and hit an author with that, then I expect that to end up in my author. Yes, of course, we're going to have a book that gets added. So what we could do is another assertion for this. Let's go ahead and grab that book, save it to a variable, say book, give me your first one. And what I want to assert is the following. This assert equals, and what I want to assert is that the ID of the author column ends up being ID of 1. So we could say grab that book variable, and let's go ahead and grab the book ID. You can either grab the book ID. Eventually, we're going to have a relationship for that, so we'll go ahead and add that. But for now, let's just compare IDs. Where did I get this ID from? Well, if we want to keep it the same, we can always say, all right, go ahead and grab the author And let's just grab the first author in our database. And then instead of using a hard-coded 1, let's go ahead and use author ID. And either one would work. Obviously, we know our database is clean before every test, so we can kind of predict what the IDs are going to be. But if you want to be really, really explicit, that's one good way to do it. All right, so let's go ahead and run this test, and let's work through all of the errors and see if we can implement this in our project. So the very first thing we get is, of course, we have a size match of 0. So right off the bat, this right here is already failing. So we got all the way through this, and we were not getting any errors. Now that's because we're really not testing anything on this end right here. Yes, truthfully, if you were to add this, it would work. So we're going to have to work a little bit through our code to make that actually work. So let's think about this for a second. So we are hitting author, right? And author right now is a string. But what we're really trying to grab is the author ID. And actually, I made a mistake here. This is not book ID. This is author ID. There we go. So what we could do is maybe use Laravel's helper to help us convert this author into an author ID. Let's see what that would look like. Let's go to the author model, and let's create a new attribute. Public function, set author attribute. And of course, that's going to give us our author. And let's see what we could do here. How about this? Let's say this attribute, author ID. What if we tried to fetch that author and we said, give me the first or create. So this is a really nice Laravel helper that will figure out if something is inside our database, and it will either return the object back to us, or it will just create it and then return the object back to us. So this will accept an array, and we can say, well, the name is going to be author. Now, of course, this is going to fail for a couple of different reasons, but we're just going along with the code here and kind of letting the test guide our way through it. So we're still getting the same error over here. We haven't really quite changed anything. Let's do something. Let's actually flip these assertions. That way, I think our error is going to change. And sure enough, what we get here is that we're trying to get the ID of something that doesn't exist, because our author actually didn't get created. And the reason for that really is the fact that that date of birth is still required, right? If you remember, the date of birth is not nullable. So this should fail altogether. So let's go ahead and disable exception handling again, and let's see if we can get this error a little bit better for us. And nope, that's not going to help us. All right, so when you have cases like this, you kind of have to work through the errors slightly different. Yes, we could change our test until we can get the correct error, but I think ultimately what we are seeing here is just simply that the author is not being created. So of course, that's why everything is failing. But we're not quite getting that error. So what do we do in these cases? Now, what we could do is something called drop down a level. This is what would sort of happen when you are testing too high up in terms of layers, right? We are testing too high, and so we're having issues getting even the correct error. And the reason for that, again, is just that we are testing too high. So we are testing right now as a feature test. And a feature test kind of goes through a route and does what you think it should do. But we're still struggling to kind of even get an error out of this test. And we know there is an underlying error, but we just can't quite see it. So there's a whole nother level of test, which is a unit test. So now a unit test, as the name would suggest, basically is the lowest level where we are actually interacting with classes and objects directly. So let me show you a little bit of that, and let's see if we can get the correct error out of this. So let's go ahead and refactor this one. This is just the one that ships with Laravel. It's example.test. Let's just call it author test. Let's go ahead and refactor the test, and let's open it up. So how do we write these unit tests? Well, we do write them slightly different. Obviously, we still have the same everything up here, but how about this? Let's use refresh database. We're going to need that. And let's say a date of birth is nullable. So let's say this. If we grabbed an author, and let's say first or create, and let's just pass in a name of John Doe. So what do we expect here? Well, we expect author So we could just say assert count of 1 in the authors table. That's kind of what we've been testing all along, right? We are making sure that, in fact, we are adding an actual author to our database. All right, so let's see if we could change the error now. Let's just run that one test. Sure enough, now we are seeing that null constraint violation. Now, we kind of knew that we had an issue when we kept trying to change this test over and over to try to get an error that made sense, and we weren't able to. This test here will really never be able to reach down into the lower level, so then we have to drop and test at a lower level. So with that, now with this test, then of course, we realize that, well, the date of birth is nullable. Let's change the name of this test actually to maybe something a little bit more related to the fact that there's a name only. So let's just say only name is required to create an author. How about that? So a little bit more about what we're actually testing and not about what we're not testing. All right, so how do we make this pass? So let's go to my create authors table. And this date of birth, let's go ahead and make that nullable. All right, let's run that test again. And now we get green. Okay, so we were able to solve that. And now this is under test. So an important point that I'm trying to get across here is the following. Yes, I knew that the error for this was the fact that it was not nullable. We've kind of known that all along. But if I just simply went into my migration and just added that in, and I didn't cover it with a test, and I didn't get the error, then we didn't do the steps of TDD. And the steps of TDD is we start with a green test, we change the test, and we make it fail. And then we need to change the code on a failed test to turn it into green. So we did follow the steps to add this line. I couldn't justify just adding this in because I didn't have a test that told me so, that told me, hey, this is not right. You need to make sure that that is nullable. So, all right, so with that being said, let's jump back up a level and let's try to run this test now and let's see what we get. And so now we're getting that we're trying to get an ID of a property of a non-object. Now we know that sort of the next level of this is the fact that there is no author underscore ID in our book. And we know that for a fact. So how about we drop down a level again and try to fix that error. PHP artisan. We do need to make a new test, and this is going to be my book test. Now you can also pass in the -- unit. And what that will do is actually create a unit test as opposed to just a default feature test. And if we go back here, now we do see here that I have the book test. All right, so what do we need here? Let's add a new test and say an author ID is recorded. Okay, so let's check this out. Let's do author. Remember, we are actually creating right at the very root level of our project. We are not going through an endpoint. We're reaching in, grabbing the model, and creating something. And this is what makes this a unit test. Otherwise, we would still be doing a feature test. So we are reaching in and really grabbing the stuff in the database and manipulating it. So what's the first thing we do? We do need a title. And we could use Faker even for this if we wanted to. I'm just going to go ahead and maybe say cool title. And what else is required? Let me go to my create books table, migration, and we need a title. And yes, an author is required, right? And right now we haven't refactored our test, so of course that is still required. The next thing is I want an author underscore ID. And we could set that equal to 1 just for now because I'm only interested in the fact that I want this to exist. So then we could say this assert count again of 1 if I grab all of my books. Whoops, I made a mistake there again. It is not author, it's book. All right, we're making sure that we're grabbing a book. This is our book test. All right, sorry about that. All right, so now let's run this test and let's see what we get. So now we get there's no such table as books. Of course, we know this error very well. Let's go ahead and use refresh database. All right, let's try that again. And so now we get the error that we wanted. We knew that there was no column by the name of author ID. So now let's go ahead and add that in. So I'll go in here into my migration. And no, I'm not going to erase the author just yet, right? So I'm going to say table unsigned big integer is going to be author underscore ID. All right, let's go back here and run that test. And now we get the failure we're looking for. We get a constraint violation on books.author. Author obviously is no longer what we're going to be using. So now with a failing test, I'll go ahead and delete this line and let's run that test one more time. And sure enough, now we are passing. All right, let's do this again. Let's go back to the book test and run this a new author is automatically added test. Let's see what we get from that one now. We get a different error altogether. Let's see what we have to solve here. So it says that there is no column named author. Of course, we know that. So let's go back here. And of course, I'm hitting an endpoint with the name of author. But we know that that's not quite the correct thing. Rather, sure, we're going to hit it with an author, but of course, we do at some point want to convert this. So let's check out the controller very quick. Let's go to the book controller, and let's go right here, right at the store method. We are validating the request, and of course, we do have an author that is being passed in, and it is required. So that we are passing into our database. But at some point, we kind of need to interject this a little bit and change it. So what I can actually do is change this over to author ID is going to be required. And yes, I'm going to get a string at first. But if we go to the book model, oh, it looks like I put that in the wrong place. I think I put it in the author model. All right, so I'm going to grab this. If you remember, I wrote this a little bit earlier in this episode. So let me go ahead and cut that out of the author. And let's put that inside the book model. That's the one that it actually needs it. So there we go. So we're going to set the author attribute. The one that we want to set is actually the author ID attribute. And so we're going to make sure that we convert this string author into the correct author. All right, let's run the test again and let's see what we get. All right, so now we're getting a validation exception. All right, so we changed the error. That's good. So now let's go back to the books controller, and author ID is required. So why is it giving us an error? All right, so let me go to my book management test. And right now, we are still passing in author. But what we really need is author underscore ID. And I think that that will fix this error that we're having right now. And let's see. All right, so we got a new error. Great. So now we are failed to assert that that matches 1. All right. So I think that this is just an error in our actual test. Let's go to book management test, line 100. Book management test, line 100. All right, so let's check out what we're getting for this book. So if we said die and dump, go ahead and give me the book author underscore ID. Let's see what we're getting there. So it looks like we're getting an error on author ID. And what we're actually getting is just this big string. We surely must have made a mistake in our implementation. Let's go back and check out that setter that we made inside the book model. And let's see. All right, I see what the problem is. So right now, we are setting this whole thing to the entire object. If we wrap this in a parentheses, all we really need is just the ID. We don't need the whole thing. The whole thing gets created on its own. So if we run that again, now we get 1. So now we could go back to our test. And in the book management test, we can delete that line. And let's run this test. And there we go. Finally. Now this was a big refactor, right? There was a lot going on. We had to go in. We had to come back out. We made a couple of mistakes here and there. But through all of this, the test was the one that was guiding our code. And that's kind of the point that I was trying to make. I just want you to see sort of the flow and how it goes when you're writing tests. Yes, at first it's a little frustrating to not be able to just go in and change your code and make the test pass. You need to let the errors be the ones that tell you what you need to write. That's a very important lesson in TDD. So let's go ahead and run the whole suite, and I bet you everything's going to blow up now. So this is another common thing. So yes, our actual one test we were running, we got that passing, but now we have a bunch of different failures, right? And we have failures in different tests. And now we need to make sort of the same changes to our other tests. So let's do one at a time. A book can be added to the library, our very basic test. Let's go ahead and just run a book can be added to the library. All right, so we're getting the actual 0 matches size 1. Back to PHP Storm. And I believe it's the first one here. Yep, a book can be added to the library. Well, I could tell you right away. The problem is probably the fact that this is no longer author. But I think we got a good opportunity here for a quick refactor. And it is the following. We have this array, and I can actually copy it over and over. We have this array, and this happens a lot in tests. You'll have this array of valid data, what we would consider a full array that passes every validation and everything's good with it. But we keep repeating it over and over. We make small tweaks to it, but ultimately it's the same array. So what I actually like to do is extract this into its own method. And let's just call it data. You could call it just about anything you like. I'll just call it data. So let's refactor that. So now down here, we have this new private function for data. Let's go ahead and clean this up. We don't need that. And all it does, it returns that data. So it returns an array. So if we go back up to our test, to make this test pass, then all we need to do is make sure that this is author_ID. And I think that will work. And yes, it does. So that test is passing again. Let's go ahead and run the whole suite. And now we have 2 failures, right? We see here, failures 2. And the next one is an author is required. All right, so this was when we were testing out our validation. So let's check this out. An author is required. So this array here is sort of the same array, but only author is omitted. So perhaps what we could do is use a PHP function called array merge. Now the way array merge works is it takes the first array and it tries to merge it with the second array and third array and fourth and so on and so forth. Now if there are any duplicate keys, right, the key in the latter part is the one that's going to take precedence. So if we said this data, that's our first array, but then as a second array we overrode the author_ID and set that equal to an empty string, then yes, this will have an author ID, a valid one. But then we're going to go ahead and pass a second array where that one is actually set equal to an empty string. So that one is actually the one that's going to end up being posted to our endpoint. So all right, let's go ahead and run this again. We are asserting that it is missing error for author, and we need to be asserting that it's error author_ID. There we go. All right, let's run the suite again. All right, so we have one more failure. A book can be deleted. All right, let's see how we can fix that one. Let's go back here. A book can be updated. A book can be deleted. So there we go. So of course, we get the same issue we had here before. Let's change this over to our new data method, and I think that might just fix it. All right, so now we have one more in a book can be updated, and it looks like this one is in line 54. So let's scroll up to line 54, and there it is. So we are grabbing a book, but we are not creating the book because again, we have the same exact error. Let's change this over to this data using our new helper, and let's see what we get. All right, so we're still getting an error there, and of course it is that our actual data is not being updated. And I bet you it has to do with the fact that we're still passing in author instead of author_ID. So let's go ahead and fix that now. And now, of course, we are failing to assert that new author is what we got back. Now remember, before when we passed in new author, then of course we were getting back new author. But now what we're really getting is just an ID. So we can change this test over to just being an ID of 1. But is it 1 or should it be 2? Let's check this out. This is still going to fail. It fails because it's null, meaning that there's nothing there. And the error has to do with this right here. We're grabbing the author, but again, we need to be grabbing the author ID. It's still going to fail because it's really going to be 2. So think about this for a second. When we hit the first endpoint, we're going to create an author with the particular string that we passed in. Then we're going to hit that point again, and that author is not going to match the author we already have. So it's actually going to create a new author in the database for us and return the ID for that person. So that one is actually going to be 2. So that should actually make our test green again. And if we run the entire suite, we are back to green. So with that, we've completed the full circle. We've been able to implement that the book actually creates an author if it doesn't exist. Now again, this whole flow, it is a lot faster in real life. We just spent a lot of time talking about why we're doing what we're doing, but in real life, this would go much, much faster. At this stage, yes, we do need some relationships. We still don't have any relationships because really from my book, I should be able to just fetch my author. But of course, that's going to be a lesson for another day where we start to put together these two things and we start to create those relationships. But for today, we're going to wrap it up with that. And don't forget to subscribe. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer those for you. Go ahead and implement this in your project. And when you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson.